Hello. Welcome back to school. My name is Katie Slider, and I have been working this summer with the socio-emotional group committee for back to school, and specifically I've been working with the equity team that we've kind of created there. And we have decided that it is really important for us to talk about and begin looking at how to be an anti-racist district and how we can do that. So I'm here today to present. And like I said, my name is Katie Slider. I work at the junior high. I teach 8th grade English, but I've been in the district. This is my 18th year. So many of you are familiar faces to me if I could see you right now. So let's get going. First of all, these are the contents. This is what we're going to talk about today. Number one, why anti-racism and why now? Why are we doing this? What is racism? Getting a good definition for that. Looking at what the police and race have to do with each other. And then that moves us to the school to prison pipeline. And then examining our privilege and how we can use it for good. And then we'll wrap up with how to start your own anti-racist journey. All right, let's look at the what, why, and how. We're going to learn what racism looks like and how we can move toward anti-racism as opposed to just not being racist. Why is to help us meet the social, emotional, and behavioral needs of all of our students in our district through the lens of anti-racism. And how we're going to do that is through information sharing and dialogue about being educators that embody anti-racism. Okay, so our learning targets, let me move my little face up here since that's not the important thing. All right, our learning targets today are that you can identify what racism is, that the staff will identify what racism is, that you can understand how historically schools and the system of education in general have been complicit in the oppression of students of color, and that staff can begin their own anti-racist journey. I will say I am not an expert. I've been studying some anti-racist learning a lot this summer, but it started even before then. But I am not an expert and I am not a person of color, obviously. So I cannot speak for everyone, who's been oppressed. I can only tell you what I've learned and hope that it will spark some conversations and some real experts coming into the district. So moving on to our success criteria, knowing that you're learning today from somebody who's not an anti-racist expert, but someone who wants to be on this journey with you, our success criteria will look like this. Staff will be able to define racism and explain why we need to move toward anti-racism as a district. Staff will be able to explain how privilege, police brutality, and the school-to-prison pipeline have contributed to the oppression of students of color. And you'll know how to access the tools and resources to begin your own anti-racist journey. All right. So here is a timeline that some of my fellow committee members collaborated on. This timeline, this one starts March 13 when Breonna Taylor was murdered. However, we all know that, I hope we all know that this is not the beginning of racial injustice and unrest in our country. This has been going on for centuries. There have been a lot of things leading up to this. I can tell you that I can remember when I was in high school, the big news was Rodney King. But it was before that, so, and on into history. Our current timeline of 2020, that starts in March because there are other things going on even before March. But since being together as a staff and having our students around us, first Breonna Taylor was murdered in her home. She was shot by police officers mistakenly. And then the very next day is when everyone was mandated to stay home because of the pandemic. After that, George Floyd was murdered, and it was all over the news, and it was all over everywhere, internet everywhere. In June, people had their protests, peaceful protests, but there was also unrest, and some of those protests turned dangerous, and we know that from watching the news. Also in June, there were some good things that happened. We had the 2 Supreme Court rulings protecting LGBTQ rights, as well as our DACA students, our Dreamers. So those all came up. Other things that have been going on, I've listed, well, my collaborators and I have listed over on this side. There's been a lot of racism towards Asian Americans. And, just with calling the pandemic the Kung flu and other racist slurs. And there have definitely been people who've had to be confronted with this sort of racism as well. And then there are also some local data and articles here about the pandemic and how it's disproportionately affected our Latino and our Black communities in Michigan and in Kent County. We've also given you a link here that says, why now, white people? Because it kind of goes with this timeline of why, even though we've been dealing, not we, even though our country has seen this unrest and people of color have been calling out and crying for this to stop killing Black people, stop, the madness. Why now? And it's really complicated, right? One of the things in the article, if you decide to click on it and read it, talks about the pandemic and the stay home and how we aren't distracted by everything else in our lives. And it's right there, and social media is right there. And it's sort of this confluence of not having anywhere to go or anything to do, but also having right at our fingertips information and videos and access to being able to post our own thoughts and feelings. And it's all there, and it's all created this perfect, well, nothing we know here is perfect, but it's created this maelstrom for sort of an explosion of upset, but also call for reform, call for dismantling certain things, and call for being better. And that's what we're hoping to do, is to see all this and know our students have been at home. They have been witnessing these things. They have been unpacking with their own families and communities. But we have all been a part as a district. And we know as our district family, we process things differently than we do in our own subcategories. So we have all been a part and not been able to process together as a Wyoming family. So know that students are coming in with a lot. They're coming in with a lot that's been going on. And they will all have their own opinions, and they will all come with their own preconceptions and experiences based on what they have seen and known and unpacked with their families. All right, so that is what is going on. That is why we are doing this. Before we jump right into racism, I think it's really important to understand our identity. So much of my presentation today has come from a couple books. And one of them is called, this book is Antiracist by Tiffany Jewell. And she says in there, you are everything within you and everything that surrounds you. And she talks about the invisible box of dominant culture in the United States. And she lists these things that you see in the box as identities that we have that have the most access, that have the most power and say in creating rules, laws, and institutions. But you'll notice that I made white large and bold, because if you see the note, it says the identities are not weighted the same. You can be all of these things except white, and a white person who is none of these identities except white will have more access and power. And we'll get more to that and what that looks like and how that can be used for good. But it is a fact in our country that if you are white, that is a powerful identity to have, as far as being able to have access to things, as far as having barriers removed from your life, and for having say and being in charge of creating rules, laws, institutions, and systems. And that is not to say that being white equals easy life, but we will get into that later. So just to keep in mind as we're going forward with this, that these tend to be the dominant culture identities in the United States. This will vary from country to country, but here in the United States, being these things means that you have a better chance of having a seat at the table. And if you are white, you have the best chance of all to have a seat at that table. All right, next, let's look at the difference between race and identity. This one is interesting because I think a lot of people think, well, race is biological, right? Like it's science. It's really not. People created race. Yes, the color of your skin is determined by your genetics. However, anything else to do with your race is social. Race and ethnicity are both social constructs. You'll notice in red, I say racism created race. When before the United States even had slavery, when slavery was very first invented, I guess you might say, they had to decide how to justify enslaving people and why other people should support that. So what happened was they created a hierarchy of people, and they labeled people by the color of their skin and by physical attributes. And in this hierarchy, it placed white European, Caucasian is a word that was used, people at the top, which were those were the beauty standards, those were the intelligence standards, those were all the physical. They believed white people had higher intelligence, were better workers, were smarter, were more beautiful, all of this. And then they created this hierarchy where at the very bottom were the dark black Africans. And they made this hierarchy, and from that, racism was created because we had to keep the hierarchy in place. And in order to keep the hierarchy in place to benefit the top, we needed to keep continuing pushing people down. So that is what happened over time. And that hierarchy was already in place when the first Africans were enslaved and stolen and brought here. So that and that is what our country has been built on, that hierarchy. There have been, obviously, we teach the civil rights movement, we teach about Jim Crow and everything, but that doesn't mean that hierarchy's been dismantled completely. We've all been born into it and socialized into it to the point where it's unconscious for many people until it's been made conscious. So also on here, you'll see that white, black, brown, and indigenous are defined by the United States as these things. White being European ancestors, black being ancestors from Africa and areas in the Caribbean, brown being Asian or Latinx, and indigenous being First People. That is also a social contrast or social construct because it is not necessarily based in science. It's not based in science at all. And we know that there are people who have Latinx background who do not identify as brown. They identify as white. And we know that there are mixed race people who do not identify as white. They identify as black, even if they are light skinned. So it is an unfair hierarchy, and it is an unfair labeling system from the get-go. Race differs from ethnicity because it's not based on physical attributes. It's more language, tradition, history, or country of origin. But again, this is not based on science. This is just a labeling system that our country uses. And the definitions often change, and other countries do it differently. I know South Africa has race labels that are different than ours, and other countries have ethnicity labels that are different than ours. So the fact that they can be different wherever you go shows that it is pretty arbitrary. All right, so now that we know the difference between race and ethnicity, we can move on to our big first learning target, which is defining racism. So most people were brought up with this binary that you are either racist or you are not. And that if you are racist, you are somebody who hates Black people, you're afraid of Black people, you support, people like David Duke and the KKK, and you think of Hitler exterminating certain races. Those people are racist. If you do not hate Black people and you don't want that stuff to happen, then you are non-racist. Well, racism isn't really a binary. Racism is more complicated than that. So we have a two-part definition here from Tiffany Jewell, who says racism is a personal prejudice and bias and systemic misuse and abuse of power by institutions. And even the personal prejudice and bias, which is the first part of the definition that we're going to look at, is not as simple as either racist, not racist. So let's unpack that. All right, Ken, let me move my face. You don't need to see me so much. All right, so prejudice is the personal side of racism. It's the attitude towards an individual or group, and it's based on the social group they belong to. And those can take the form of stereotypes, misinformation, and fear. And we're going to touch slightly here on microaggressions today because those are based from both fear and stereotypes. And they are things that can be said or unsaid. They can be intentional or unintentional as an insult, but they're aimed at someone's identity that doesn't fit in what we're talking about today, that doesn't fit that white dominant culture, the default being white. And they're always harmful. Even if we say, well, I was just kidding around, I didn't mean anything by it, it still can be harmful. So microaggressions can look like, on this side, it says our students, whether they recognize it or not, encounter dozens of microaggressions a day. They may not have the language to say, wait a minute, that was a microaggression, but they still internalize what happens. And some examples of microaggressions are when you say to a student, a student of color, you are so well spoken. Wow. Or to their parents. Or if you tell a kid who presents as Latino that, wow, you speak really great English. You don't know about those kids, and you're making assumptions based on white is default. And wow, for not being white, you're doing a really good job being white. That's harmful, and it makes assumptions. Assuming that, or being pleasantly surprised when a Black student has both parents come to teacher conferences or dad shows up. Those are all based in stereotypes and misinformation. Telling a student after spring break, hey, look, my skin is almost as dark as yours. Microaggression. You're again saying, look at me, I'm normally the default, but now I'm almost matching you. What does that tell our students? So we need to, and there is a link here. Anything in here that's underlined is linked. So there's a document linked on the microaggressions that really goes into some other really good examples of both spoken and non-spoken things that we might do without even thinking about it. We just think we're saying it in fun, but in fact, we are projecting our bias and our stereotypes and our misinformation onto our students and their families. And what happens when we do that is that the racism gets internalized. Whether, like I said, students probably aren't consciously thinking, wow, my teacher is really racist, but something inside of them is telling them that they don't fit in the box. And that contribute to low self-esteem, depression, poor health, and then also believing those stereotypes and that you're inferior and that you don't fit into a box, you fit into the stereotype instead. And really, it's not about us. It's not about us as white people. We need to remember that the effect is larger than our intent. The effect of what happens is more important than our intent. Our intent could be to be just kidding, but if we are hurting our students, our intent does not matter. I often tell my own children, you might bump into me and leave a bruise because you were running past me and you were being careless, but you weren't aiming for me, but you left this bruise. You'll say you're sorry and you'll feel really bad that you caused harm, but you didn't mean to. But you not meaning to doesn't mean my arm isn't bruised. I'm still hurt. So it's important to remember that just because we didn't mean something doesn't mean we didn't do harm. So the next thing that we're going to look at is a little reminder here that you can, if you claim not to see color, you're not seeing the whole child. Angela Davis, who is still a famous activist, says in a racist society, it is not enough to be not racist. We have to be anti-racist. And that is the point that we're trying to move towards. If you claim not to see that you're saying, I don't see color in my classroom, all kids are just kids, you're not seeing the whole child, because being not white is part of their identity, and it's a beautiful part of their identity, and it's something that we need to pull in rather than shut down. So don't discolor your students, don't erase them, see them, but also see them without stereotype. And that's the whole anti-racist journey, because we might catch ourselves doing the stereotyping and the bias and have to say, oh my gosh, I'm being racist right now. And just by acknowledging that, we're starting to break it down and be more anti-racist. And I also have the note here that statistics need to be examined, which we're going to do in a few minutes, but we also need to make sure that we don't use those same statistics to stereotype and pigeonhole all of our students, because those are not all of our kids' stories. Not all of our kids come from those same statistics. So just because a large number of Black and brown students are X or fit into this box or have a tendency to do this does not mean that applies all across the board. Just like white people tend to do this does not mean that I fall into that category. It's the same. All right, let's look at the second half of the definition. So if the first half is the personal prejudice and bias, the second half of racism is the systemic misuse and abuse of power by institutions. So institutions include things like businesses, housing, and healthcare, which I've linked here as, so if you want to read up on how racism is impacted into and built into those systems, you can. But we're going to focus more on the misuse and abuse of power in the government, specifically in our policing departments, and then also in how that affects education. So Tiffany Jewell says we make assumptions based on what we do not see or know. And the important question to ask is, who has the power to make these decisions, laws, rules, etc.? Personal prejudice and abuse of power go together, because who has a seat at the table? As we saw in the dominant culture, it's usually white people. So if white people have the power to make decisions, laws, and rules, they're going to make decisions, laws, and rules that mainly work for them. Because if you have a seat at the table, you're advocating for yourself and those like you. So we have to examine who is left out of these systems, who is left out of our government, our policing, and our education, and the rules that are made around those. So first we're going to talk about race and police. So this is a loaded topic, I know. We all have pretty strong opinions, personal beliefs. We know and love people who are on the police force or have been involved in the police force. I want to reiterate that this is not about our own opinions. It's not about our own beliefs. It is not about what we think about the police. It's not about good cops or bad cops. There are both. This is about the system of police and the system of race intertwining and being at odds. Statistically, over time, police and race do not match. And I'm going to go over here a super brief history of policing in the United States. But we need to remember that this history plus our student and their family experiences are what we're focusing on. We're not focusing on, well, I know this cop who's so good and he got into the police force to, fight racism. Great. But the police force itself is built on racism and has the racism in it. We do need cops like that, but we really need is to know that the entire system has been rigged. So if you look on this side of my screen, I've given you a really super general and brief history about police and race. I suggest reading Stamped by Ibram X. Kendi if you like a big, huge, fat history book on racism, or the remix version that he did with Jason Reynolds that's more kid approachable, that I think is also more adult approachable if you're not, super academic wanting to read a history book. He does go through a lot of more detail on these things if you would like more. But basically, as a summary, police started in the South, in the South and North. In the South, it started as laws that allowed slave patrols all the way back to the 17th century because they wanted to empower whites to capture the black slaves. Because this would do two things. One, it would keep the blacks down at the bottom of that hierarchy and in their place as slaves and on the plantations. But the second thing, and the not as promoted thing, was that it would empower the poor whites to oppress the poor blacks, as well as the wealthy plantation owners and everybody else. It drew a line between poor whites and poor blacks that wasn't there before. So in a way, what it did was prevent them from, they would have been the largest population, poor black and whites, and if that, if there was a rise up in that, then that could have been the end of slavery all the way from then. So they needed to be able to turn the poor whites against the blacks, and by creating slave patrols, they did that. In the North, the policing was formed to control laborers, who are the lower class, mostly poor whites and blacks. So again, policing in the United States was originally created to keep the hierarchy in place, to keep the wealthy whites at the top, wealthy white men at the top, and keep everyone down to the poor black enslaved people at the bottom. In the early 1900s, a police chief named August Vollmer from California travels around, revolutionizes policing for the worst, because he realizes that when you use harsh techniques on minorities, immigrants, and poor, not many people say anything. But when you use it on, the wealthy and the white plantation owners and business owners, people don't like that. So instead of saying, ooh, we should, make this equal, he says, no, we should definitely use all of these horrible, harsh techniques then on the lower class and minorities and people of color and poor, because it will keep them in their place. And for a long time, that was the mentality of the police in the United States, was to use more force and more harsh techniques on the people at the bottom of the hierarchy than at the top. So this already, again, is disproportionately affecting people of color. And then, as we know, police brutality against minorities has been prevalent for all of our lives, throughout the 1900s and now into the 2000s, where our timeline from March begins. Like I said, it was not the beginning of police brutality in March. It was just where people started to wake up more for whatever reason and get involved. White people, I should say, have been waking up and getting involved. So this is where our students are and their families are with what policing is. They may know some very nice people who are cops. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The entire policing in the United States has been based and formed in order to keep Black people and people of color at the bottom. So that then has contributed to our school to prison pipeline. Our public schools systems see Black and brown children as violent, disruptive, unpredictable future criminals, because that is what we have been told all the way since our friend August, Captain August, found those policing things and said, these people are animals, they need to be beaten down, they need to have harsher techniques. And that nobody has actually spoken that to us, I hope. But that's the system that we are in. That is what we have been socialized to from the minute we were born. So these are statistics. These are facts. Black students are 3.5 times more likely to be suspended than white students. That collaborates exactly what we were talking about with policing, right? Harsh punitive discipline in schools leads to the destruction of student trust in teachers and schools and destroys their self-esteem. Students who are suspended are more likely to have a repeat year of school and or drop out. And students arrested at school are more likely to be arrested again in the future. So if we are if we are not serving our Black and brown students in the same way that we are serving our white students, we are contributing to this school to prison pipeline that has been in place since education in America began. And another fun fact, the history of the education in the United States starts with making sure that the rich, wealthy, white men in America have access to education and furthering themselves. Women were not allowed. Black people were definitely not allowed. And obviously, we know that that has changed because of civil rights laws and what have you. But the structure and system of education itself has not changed. And that is where the problem is. And that is why our school and our prison and our policing have got all mixed up together into one big racist mess and very oppressive to students. So these are some of the contributing factors. I got all of this information out of the book, So You Want to Talk About Race, and I've linked to it at the end of the presentation. Contributing factors to all of this happening. And I will be honest and say that in Wyoming, we may or may not have huge problems with this. Okay, we may not have giant problems with some of these things, but they still exist because we're still an educational system in the United States. So contributing factors, racial bias of school administrators and teachers. We all have bias. We are a largely white staff. We can't escape our bias. So if it is unexamined and just assumed that we are not racist, we have our bias. We need to work on it. A lack of cultural sensitivity for our Black and brown students. Assuming that our Black kids are automatically criminal. Zero tolerance policies with things like attendance and dress code, and increased police presence in schools. In order to address these, OLO suggests these things. Include the school to prison pipeline in discussions about inequity and oppression, which we're doing right now. Examine and question our own school and district data. And as I said earlier, as we look at that, we have to be sure that we're not saying, okay, so Black kids are more likely to get suspended. We don't want to start looking at every Black kid as a possible suspension. That is the opposite of what we want to do. So we want to make sure that we're using that data to inform and to see what we've been doing, but not to pigeonhole anyone. We want to recognize and celebrate the achievements of our Black and brown children. We want to normalize being Black and brown. We want to fight against that idea that white is the default. We want to challenge any language or stereotypes about Black and brown kids. We want to discuss the deeper causes of defiant antisocial behavior in our Black and brown kids, which I believe will be available in the Wolfpack things as well. We want to make sure we're not erasing our disabled Black and brown children. And we want, this is a big one for me, we want to decenter the whiteness from our curriculum. We don't want, if we're teaching a unit on inventors, we don't want every inventor to be white. We don't want our Black children to think that their history starts with slavery. So we need to be sure that we are bringing in positive and positive things for our students to see. All right, next. Okay, so at the beginning, I said we needed to use our privilege for good. And in order to do that, we need to be able to remember that invisible box of dominant culture. So in the box, we remember that being white gives us the most access and privilege over other identities. But one thing that I wanted to make sure to point out, that just like racism isn't a binary of good and not good, of good and evil, that we can be racist and anti-racist at the same time. And especially if we are examining things when we notice that they're racist, that is anti-racist. So it ebbs and flows together. Privilege is the same, right? It does not mean that being white equals easy, problem-free, better lives than anyone else. It does not mean that we don't have challenges. It does not mean that there are no barriers for us to surpass as we go through life. It just means that there are certain barriers that are not there for us and can never be there for us because we are white. Some of those barriers include being judged. For instance, nobody will ever deny me an interview based on my first name. My first name is Katie. It is super white. It is super traditional. Nobody is going to look at my name and throw my resume, in the trash pile because it's hard to say or because it sounds ethnic. So, and they want easy to say names. They might throw it into the trash pile for other reasons, but it won't be because of my white name. I won't be that, so that barrier is not there. Those are the kind of barriers that our students deal with. And our students of color deal with. And so we need to be sure that we recognize that and we help, we listen and we learn. So the things that I have on here are that we need to listen and learn from people who are not in this box, especially non-whites. That does not mean to track down the people of color on your building staff and have them represent the entire race for you. Please do not do that. I don't want to speak for the entire white race, and I'm assuming that they do not want to speak for the entire, black, brown, whatever race, Asian. So do not make them the spokesperson for their race. It does mean that we should be inviting those voices to speak. They may say no. They may not want to be that voice on the table, but we can't know that if they're not invited. The second thing says to frequently reflect on your own bias. I've mentioned this a few times, to continue to look back. Ask what voices and people are missing from the discussion, collaborate and work in solidarity with others, and then don't fall into the trappings of charity or saviorism. We are not here, our kids don't need saving. We're not here to solve their life problems for them. They can do that on their own with their families. We are here as support. We are here as not giving charity, but giving ears and eyes and bearing witness to their experiences so that hopefully other people and the white kids in our class can learn that we bearing witness to what others are doing is important, and what their experiences are is valid and important to breaking down this invisible box. All right, so we're ready to start our own anti-racist journey. Ibram X. Kendi, author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, says the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify it and describe it and then dismantle it. So anti-racism is consistently looking at yourself, looking at others, identifying when you see racism or questioning it, describing it, and then dismantling it, quitting it. So these are some things that you can do to start your own anti-racist journey right this minute. The big thing, I've mentioned many of these things as we went along. I will give a little plug for the Wolfpack session that Chelsea Diaz and I will be having on Friday, where we talk about equity in the classroom a little bit more specifically. But a lot of these things are things that I've already talked about. The big thing is to remember it is not about you. It is about our students and their families. And then the last thing that I have on here are some resources. These are all resources that I have used over the summer and before. If you click on them, it brings you to the descriptions and summaries of them. That is something that you can do on your own. Here's some more recommended reading. Again, if you click on these things, some of these are on my to-read pile, some are not yet. Hopefully they will be. Again, they're clickable. And then lastly, I want to bring us back to these learning targets. And hopefully you'll have time as a staff to talk about these. And I want to close with one thing that I liked about Tiffany Jewell's book. This book is Antiracist, other than it being super accessible, is that she says in it, when she talks about starting the anti-racist journey, she talks about us all being in the same lake. We're all in the same lake on the same journey. Some of us are in speedboats. We are accustomed to lakes. We feel comfortable on lakes. We know how to get through this, and we know where to find the tools, and we know how to find people to collaborate with and to work in solidarity with. Some of us are in rowboats. We know a little bit, but we're learning. And some of us are just sticking our toe in. This might be some brand new information for some of us. But we also need to remember that there are people, specifically people of color, who don't even know that the lake exists, that they do not have access yet to this anti-racist journey because they have not been given that access. So we are all in different places. I'm hoping that by giving you guys this presentation that I have given you access to an anti-racist lake that you can take your journey and take it at your own time. I hope that you have constructive discussions about this in your building, and I look forward to being on this journey and collaborating with all of you. Thank you for giving up your time today for me.